Yurth. He's a consultant. He's got a very deep professional background, and he's also done a lot of volunteer work in the community. He's obviously quite a pillar of the community here, working with United Way, Girl Scouts, Exchange Club, many other organizations. His focus professionally has been in the field of technology development, invention management, and integration consulting. Some of the projects he's been involved with include networking, analytics and research, product market delivery. He's invented or co-invented some integration technology devices, including the X chip, which is a television program content filter, while rubber lanes, commercialization process, dialogue language replacement system, wireless video conferencing system, and page-turn computer display system, among many, many other things. He's also an author, 10 books now, and more than a dozen screenplays and 23 scientific papers. So David Yurth is definitely a strong speaker here, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks very much. We got this thing working? All you do is just push the right button. Oh, wonderful. Oh, the stalwart few still remaining. You've all been here for a long time today. I appreciate you hanging around. Try to give you something that makes it worth your time. Let's see, how many of you are here from out of town? Wow. Well, we'll try to give you your money's worth here today. I'm going to do three things here with you, and let's come to agreement on time. What does our timeline look like? You've got a dinner coming up, what, in an hour?
What do you need? Your presentation is 60 minutes what you need, or?
Plus or minus.
Okay, everybody feel comfortable with 60 minutes? Yeah.
All right.
Sounds like a majority there.
All right, and if you feel like you need to get up to take a break, go right ahead. We'll just proceed without you. My feelings are not easily hurt, so. All right, we're going to do three things here. The first thing we're going to try to do is give you some ideas about the ongoing research we're doing with respect to creating a new atomic model. The person after whom this conference and this organization was named, Nikola Tesla, understood things about the way nature works that are no longer understood or have for a century been misunderstood or misinterpreted. We now have some very rigorously validated scientific evidence which helps us understand, relearn, and rediscover many of the things that Tesla knew and nobody could understand. So I'm going to try to give you the basis of a new model of scalar physics, and we're going to whiz through this in a big hurry. Don't worry about missing the information. If you want a copy of the model, it will be made available both through the International Tesla Society or through the Nova Institute of Technology at no charge. All you have to do is just send me an email, go to our website, and if you want a copy of this, what we call the Y-bias model of angularity, we'll just go ahead and send it to you on your email. All right? So that'll give you some way to track it. And our address on the internet is www.novainstituteoftechnology.com. And all of our contact coordinates, email addresses, and phone numbers and everything are on there. All you have to do is just punch the contact button on the website, send an email requesting the information, and we'll send it to you. All right? Second thing I'm going to do now, when we've established the context of this new physical model, is talk with you about what that means in practical applications in terms of what we do with what we now think we know. And the third thing I'm going to do is tell you about 2 or 3 technical integrations that we've produced in the last 10 or 12 years, which are now fully functional, totally operational, and about to be brought into marketable applications. So hopefully within 50 minutes or 55 minutes we'll be able to get through that, and then if you have some questions I'll be happy to talk to you either here or afterwards at the social. All right? So let's talk about the standard model of physics. The standard model of physics is fundamentally flawed. It's fundamentally flawed. In our abstract, we say this about it. The quest of modern physics has been to develop a model which correctly describes the role and dynamics of the interactions by which nature works. In order for the model which describes these interactions to be robust, it must not only accommodate phenomena which are known to occur, but must also accommodate all rigorously documented phenomena, predict phenomena which are as yet undiscovered, and allow for the inclusion of all rigorously observed, impeccably documented, carefully reported data derived from any source. To be adequate, any universally applicable physical model must also accommodate the contemporaneous interaction between Descartes' physical stuff and the invisible spirit stuff with equal cogency. Does that communicate with you? Do you understand what we're saying there? So, and the current model simply does not rise to that standard. It simply does not. This is the name of our monograph. What we're trying to do here is provide a simple, elegant set of rules. We're trying to discover what they are and describe them in a way that makes them understandable and useful. As it now stands, the standard physical model is a hodgepodge of deeply siloed, fundamentally incompatible ideas, results of some experimental evidence gathered over a century and a half, and a whole bunch of political imposition that then provides us with some kind of cockamamie idea about what goes on in the natural world. But the fact of the matter is that the natural world, in most instances, specifically at the finer scales, is not describable by the standard model, for reasons we'll talk about, and doesn't behave as the standard model says. It just doesn't. Tesla knew that. Tesla knew things that the standard model now ignores. Physics says that everything in the universe was created in the instant of one singularity, one seminal event called the Big Bang. Everything was created in that instant. Unfortunately, most world-renowned physicists are now saying that it's simply not a defensible idea because everything about the Big Bang violates every single principle of the standard physical model. It's not sustainable. And it didn't happen in the first place. Okay, it just didn't happen. So, what's wrong with the standard physical model? What's wrong with it? It has some real interesting shortcomings, doesn't it? There's a fairly long list of them here. This is not necessarily an exhaustive list, but it does talk about some of the things that we know are experimentally verified. There are people in this room who've been involved in the rigorous, impeccably documented experimental verification of some or all of these phenomena. And none of them are accommodated by the standard model. And some of them are fundamental to the way nature works. They're just fundamental. I won't spend a lot of time going through each one of these, but when you go through the model, when you look at the paper, we'll document all of this stuff for you in a way that will give you probably more than you wanted to know. In terms of getting the model straightened out, 3 very important documents have been created, and I doubt very much whether many of you have ever heard about this in this room. You're familiar with Maxwell's electrodynamic formulas. Everybody's heard of them. Maxwell, Faraday, all the quaternion formulas. Do you know that not a single one of Maxwell's original formulas appears in any physics text anywhere in the world? Not a single one of those equations occurs in any physical text being used in accredited education anywhere in the world. And the corollary is also true. Not a single one of the formulas used in any electrical engineering textbook anywhere on the planet ever occurred in any of Maxwell's formulations. Both of those statements are true. What's the problem? What's the problem? You understand how that happened? You know what the Lorentz transform is? The Lorentz transform was presented in 1905 by a very bright Hungarian mathematician, and his whole objective was to make quaternions manageable. They didn't have computers in 1893. It would take a team of 10 guys a whole year to solve one quaternion equation, working 10 hours a day, 7 days a week. They're four-dimensional partial differential equations that take into account everything in the natural world, including time-domain polarization, which you find nowhere in anybody's electrodynamic formulations today. You just don't find them. Tommy Bearden and his group of partners in the Association of Distinguished Scientists spent 5 years, 18 guys, Myron Evans, Larry Crowell, Donnie Reed, a bunch of great people, some of the smartest people on the planet, rewrote Maxwell's electrodynamic equations and corrected the 22 basic errors and omissions that are part of everybody's electrical engineering handbook. Now that monograph has been printed. All 60 of those papers have been printed. Have any of you ever seen them? No. Have you ever heard of them? No. You got to go to the Journal of New Energy and get a copy. The Journal of New Energy printed that document. It's never been circulated widely, and it solves the fundamental missing elements of the electrodynamic equations. What's wrong with atomic theory, the model of the atom? The formulations that describe the interactions between hadrons, the nuclear particles, fundamentally escape quantum physics. Quantum physics is wrong 70% of the time. It is. And there's a very good reason for that. Because quantum mechanics is still fundamentally based on a basic kernel, an assumption that is dead wrong. And it's based on Galilean geometry, which says that the essence of the natural world and its clockwork construction operates with respect to a single dimensionless, massless point operating in a vacuum. All of quantum dynamics is based on that idea. And we know absolutely categorically for sure that that is a false idea. It's not true. Never was true. So along comes Ruggero Santilli, who did Leviathan battle with Murray Gell-Mann and the MIT group. When Gell-Mann was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1986 for the discovery and verification of 2 of 6 quarks, which at that time was thought to be the smallest, most indivisible particle of matter anywhere in nature, Santilli raised hell. He said, it's not matter, it's not a particle because it's not subject to gravitational forces. And he was right. But he ended up being blackballed. They wouldn't publish his papers. He was ostracized. He committed professional suicide, but he was right. He published a book. It's called The New Model of Hadronic Mechanics. Anybody ever heard of it? Ruggero Santilli was nominated twice for the Nobel Prize, once in math and once in physics. He was a full emeritus professor at MIT for 31 years. No lightweight. That book, that monograph, was published by the Journal of New Energy. You can go to their website and buy it. And it'll correct many of the flaws that we rely on when we do materials engineering. Likewise, a Muslim scholar from Beirut, from the American University, Mahmoud Malehi, reformulated the laws of thermodynamics. Any of you ever heard of this? Mahmoud Malehi. You can buy his paper through the Journal of New Energy. They're not in business anymore, but they got them archived. You can get them. Go on the internet and get that stuff. Because the laws of thermodynamics is the basis, the pretext, under which the American Physical Society and all the guys in the high-temperature gas-cooled nuclear reaction business who have privileged access to the federal food trough used this as the pretext for disallowing any new discoveries in the field of atomic engineering. They rely on a deliberately flawed document to protect their position. So that information is now available. Here's the primary issue. This is what Tesla understood better than anybody. In every model of electrodynamic engineering, you will find circuitry that relies on an unidentifiable source to produce the electrons at its basis. It assumes that those electrons come from somewhere, that there's a source for them. But the standard physical model cannot tell you what that source is. There is no identification in the standard model of the source charge origination. And we have Tom Bearden to thank for having solved that problem, because he figured it out. In our research, we now know something fundamental about how nature works. In the mid-90s, Ilya Prigogine and Isabel Stengers got a Nobel Prize for really breakthrough work in what they call dissipative structures. They talked about entropy. You all know what entropy is, right? You break a wine glass, you got entropy. It's gone back to a steadier state. In their work, they identified what entropy is, what it does, how it works, how it applies to things natural, how it applies to open systems and closed systems. And their thesis was that the whole cosmos is dissipative. But they couldn't answer the question, well, if the cosmos is fundamentally dissipative in all of its functions and always going to entropy, how come there are gazillions of fields of stars out there in the heavens where new stars are being born? If it's all running downhill to entropy, how come there's new stuff going on? And they didn't know. 2 years later, a guy named Per Bak, B-A-K, top scientist at the Brookhaven National Laboratories, published a watershed book that I'll bet not a person in this room has heard of, much less read. It's a very simple title called How Nature Works. And what he talked about in that book is the other half of the equation. How is it that we can't predict weather? How is it that we can't predict the rise and falls of the stock market? How is it that we can't predict volcanic eruptions and tidal waves and earthquakes and volcanoes? Why is that so? It's so because those phenomena operate according to a set of laws that he called self-organizing criticality. They operate according to a set of rules which are now rigorously validated by all kinds of experimental work, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. In the standard model, there is no room for non-local field effects. All the 4 field effects that are identified and accepted in the model are said to be primary. That is, they were there before the Big Bang. Nobody explained how they got there if there wasn't anything there yet. And they're not only a priori before the event, but they're mutually exclusive. They don't relate to each other. So electromagnetic field effects are not related in any direct, meaningful way to gravitational field effects or strong or weak nuclear forces. Well, okay, that's why Brian Greene's having an awful time coming up with a model in string theory that gives you any kind of uniformity in a unified model, because they're all said to be fundamentally mutually exclusive. Well, it's nonsense. What Per Bak and his guys proved, what Nicholas Gizan and his guys proved, what Vladimir Poponin proved, what all kinds of people are proving now in very interesting ways, is that wherever you find a local linear field effect in nature, at any scale, under any circumstances, you must also find a concomitant set of nonlinear, non-local field effects. You must find them. It is true across the board. The Standard Model doesn't recognize nonlinear field effects as even a valid idea. That's why in math, we do not have one single mathematical expression that expresses non-locality. We can make holograms, but we cannot write a mathematical expression that describes its non-local effect. We cannot write a mathematical formula that explains why, if I take a photograph of an object, and I take that two-dimensional photograph and I create a computer negative to make a hologram, and I bang those laser beams off of that baby and I create interference patterns, I get a three-dimensional object with all the features that were on the photographed object, even though I only had a two-dimensional picture. All the information is there. Some of it is local, some of it is linear, some of it's not local, and some of it's not linear, and the mathematics can't tell you why. And in nature, this is categorical. And I'm going to spend a minute telling you about a seminal experiment that really cuts to the heart of this discussion. How many of you have heard of Vladimir Poponin, the phantom DNA effect? Good grief. 1997, the Russian Academy of Sciences published a report that had been 7 years in the making. What they did was extraordinary. While the Human Genome Project is running full blast in the West, we're using our reductionist idea to take everything down to its smallest possible element, so in the chains of the chromosomes of DNA, we know where everybody lives. We think if we know what all the addresses are, we know something. What the Russians are doing is saying, you know what? This is a system, and it does some things. Maybe we ought to be looking at what it does as a system. And so they started doing that. They recognized that the double helix is an antenna. And with the chemoelectrical bias, the voltage bias across the bottoms, all these things that make up a DNA chromosome are nothing more than conductors and resistors. How many ham radio operators we got in the house? We got a few. You take two pieces of wire, string them out, put them into a helix, put resistors across them and bias a voltage. What happens? You get a radio signal, baby. You get a wave. And every time you pulse up and down that thing, you get an emission at the top. So they were getting local, linear, radio frequency signals, chemosynaptic signals, out of naturally operating DNA. And they went through rigorous experimentation to find out what those radio frequencies are, and they figured them out. All 26 different tissues and organs have a different frequency. Well, go figure. Go figure. Then they built this thing called a light scattering chamber. Picture a box 3 feet cubed. The whole building is inside a Faraday cage. The room is inside a Faraday cage. The box is inside a Faraday cage. All Faradayed at different frequencies. Took them 7 years to make this work. On one side, they've got a laser running through a diffuser, so all the little photon beams are marching in lockstep across the expanse of this box. They now have a square laser instead of a little pointy one. And on the 90-degree side, they have an array of CCD chips, which are the little chips that make that video camera work. And that's all tied into a computer. Then they use finely particulated talcum, so fine that it takes almost 30 minutes for measured amounts to go from the top of the chamber 3 feet to the floor. So they drop this stuff, they turn on the laser, they turn on the CCDs, and as this stuff falls through the air, it spins, it turns, it interacts with whatever else is in there in this atmosphere. and it refracts the laser light into the CCD chips. And the CCD chips record that information and put it in the computer, and after each set of events, they run a fast Fourier transform on the cascading pattern of light refraction to see if it's random. And after they establish absolute randomness, then they begin introducing variables. First, a Petri dish. You know what a Petri dish is. Slice the bottom off a Coke bottle, that's a Petri dish. Okay? Sterilize it, stick it in the deal, drop the dust, turn on the light, turn on the camera, run it through the computer, changes nothing. Saline solution, same pH as human blood. Put it in the Petri dish, drop the dust, turn on the light, turn on the cameras, run the transforms, nothing changes. Then they take one epithelial cell out of the mouth of one of their research assistants, one cell, one live epithelial cell out of the mouth. Put it in the saline solution, drop the dust, turn on the light, turn on the cameras, run the computer. Guess what happened? This is no longer a random event. The pattern with which this dust falls out of the air is now organized in very specific ways. And if they rotate that dish 90 degrees, the pattern of organization rotates 90 degrees. And if they bathe that field in a laser light of the right frequency and waveform, they amplify that organizing effect 1,000 times. Do you have any idea what that means to science? What that means to the Standard Model? It's fundamental. It means, first, that DNA, by its very nature in all biological systems, exerts a non-local organizing effect on the information field that defines what matter does. That's really huge. More important, we now know that there's a coupling constant between a certain frequency of light and the biological field. We can see the field with the light. We can take a picture of it. And if we're smart enough to decrypt the information that's contained in that field, then we start to see what's really going on inside DNA. The Standard Model of physics is absolutely, totally out of touch with that phenomenon, and it is impeccably documented. It's being used today, right this minute, to treat AIDS in Africa. That phenomenon has been harnessed in a way that allows them to erase the virus. For real. It's fundamental. The world works in ways that Tesla understood and the Standard Model simply cannot accommodate. And we're going to have to hurry now because I used too much time. Okay, here are some of the flawed assumptions. E equals mc squared. It's not true. We have physical devices, solid state energy accumulator devices, fill them full of electrons. They weigh more sitting still than they did when they're discharged. Liquid cell batteries don't do that. Lead acid batteries don't do that. Lithium ion polymer batteries don't do that, but solid state energy accumulator batteries do because electrons have mass. And they demonstrate mass and energy at rest, at zero velocity. That assumption is wrong. Self-organizing criticality tells us how nature works the way it does. This has been known now for more than a decade, and you've never heard of it, and it never appears in any physics literature. Subquarks. Here's one of the greatest suppression events in the history of science. Have you ever heard of a subquark? You ever heard of them? Well, let me tell you what, folks. Subquarks are the real deal. Have you heard of the CDF collaboration at Fermilabs? Murray Gell-Mann in the 80s used the Fermilab linear particle accelerators to verify 2 of the 6 quarks that his theoretical mathematics had postulated were real. 10 years later, his students used the same equipment to prove that quarks can be divided into subquarks. As a matter of fact, they published a report to Discover magazine, and it was all set to be published. 450 credentialed scientists signed that report. 450. And at the threat of professional, political, and economic extinction, they were forced to withdraw their paper. Science now, as an institution, is not about knowing the truth. Science, as an institution, is about protecting the territorial imperative claimed by people who think they own something in terms of what we know about what makes the nature work the way it does. And that's catastrophic for all of us. And what we're going to show you here is what happens in the way nature works to emerge from the physical vacuum. And by the way, the Standard Model doesn't buy the notion of a physical vacuum either. All right. We've already talked about that. We've already talked about that. You've heard of E.T. Whittaker? Whittaker's formulations? Anybody? You used to be able to get these formulas on the internet. You can't get them anymore. Come to the Nova Institute website and you'll get them. They're in the model. What E.T. Whittaker proved in 1903 in the problems that he provided solutions for was exactly what Nikola Tesla was saying. It was exactly what he was saying. What his formula says is that mass operates in both local linear and non-local nonlinear aspects, and in its non-local nonlinear aspects comes out of the same wellspring, the same source, and communicates in a way that is holographic. It is timeless. It operates without respect to time or distance. And the waves that go between masses are undulatory. They have peaks and they have valleys. And everywhere in nature we find compliance with his proof. Everything in nature operates, according to Whittaker's formulation and his solution, in terms of harmonic resonance. If there was ever a guy who knew what that meant, it was Nikola Tesla. Harmonic resonance. He understood it as well as anybody who ever lived. There's a really, really good physicist in Russia who has corresponded with us. He sends us a formula for gravitational field effect, and you'll notice in his formulation, I'll try not to shoot anybody with this thing. You'll notice in his formula right here, there's a Z. That doesn't occur in Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen formulation of gravitational field effects, and the Z represents the undulatory nature of the gravitational wave. What we've done is said, look, nature is fractal, and that's the formula for fractal evolution. And if you substitute that fractal formula for the Z in Plotnikov's gravitational field effect, what did I just do? What did I just do? Yeah, I am. Okay, there we go, thanks. If we substitute the fractal formula, you know what a fractal is. You've heard of it. Do you know what it is? Okay, here we go. We substitute the fractal formula for that Z right there, and guess what happens? Everything in nature then becomes compliant with both the demand for harmonic resonance and the Fibonacci relationships. You know what the Fibonacci numbers are? Here we go. Here we go. This is the formula for planetary motion. Oh, there's that Z again. If you take that Z and you put the fractal formula in there, you end up with a descriptor that tells you something very, very important about planetary motion and why it works the way it does. This is one of the biggest questions in astronomical physics, and they just can't get it. Well, we're going to give it to them right now. Here's the Fibonacci numbers. 0 plus 1 is 2, 1 plus 2 is 3, 2 plus 3 is 5, 3 plus 5 is 8, ad infinitum. So you take the golden series, you take the mean, 1.6180 blah blah, you take it 1 over, and it's .618033. It's the only set of numbers in the world that works like that. And if you take the Fibonacci series and you plot it two-dimensionally, guess what? It is self-reflective in every detail. It's a fractal. You map it in a two-dimensional map, and the Fibonacci series is a fractal. What does that mean? Well, you recognize that shape? It's the shape of a nautilus shell for one thing, but it's also a fundamental archetypal shape found at every scale of organization of matter and energy in the universe. It is the underlying archetypal map by which matter and energy combine to create the world we live in. And guess what happens if you square them? You recognize that pattern? How about this one? How about that baby? That's the Fibonacci series, and you're going to see it again and again. I'm going to tell you about it. Okay, so we're going to give you a scalar roadmap here that tells you how things happen. This is how it works. Nature works according to a very simple set of rules. It's not anything at all like the standard model. Not anything at all. It doesn't have a lot of famous people's names on it, for one thing. There are 5 basic rules of self-organization. Here's how we know this. Take a pile of sand, dry sand. This is the experiment. This is the seminal experiment. You take a pile of sand. You can do this at home. Go down to Home Depot and get a big load of sand, take it home, take the bags, and pour the sand in a controlled measure, in a continued process. Drop that sand, and you'll build up this cone of sand. And it'll keep building, and it'll keep building, and it'll keep building. And then all of a sudden, someplace on that cone of sand, what's going to happen? It's going to slough off, isn't it? Well, in self-organizing criticality theory, that's called an avalanche. Oh, it's an avalanche. How does that work? We can't predict avalanches, can we? Well, after you run that experiment 10,000 times, which is what Purbach and his guys did, honest to God, they sat in a laboratory and poured sand for 10,000 times. And they tried to figure out, using algorithms and predictive models and, all of this linear predictive modeling, partial differential equation stuff everybody uses to try to forecast the stock market and earthquakes and tornadoes and all that stuff, and it just didn't make any sense. It didn't work. And what they discovered was that they could not predict the time, the locale, the frequency, or the magnitude of any avalanche event. Well, if weather's fractal, we got a problem, don't we? If you can't predict the timing, locale, magnitude, or frequency of weather because it's a self-organizing critical event, complexity in an open self-organizing system, no matter how many cameras you've got in how many places with how much detail and how many satellites, the weather's still going to do what it wants to do, and you won't predict it. You won't. And it's true for earthquakes, and it's true for every other manifestation of self-organizing criticality on the planet. Anybody tells you they can predict the stock markets is lying through their teeth. They can't. And the same's true with all kinds of things. All kinds of things. What we can do is take the history of all like events. Extinction of species over 2.5 billion years. The history of all the volcanic events over the last 2 billion years. Or hurricanes or earthquakes or tsunamis or anything else. And guess what we find? That for every one of a certain magnitude, there's a certain number of others that have a logarithmic relationship to it so that when you plot them all over time, you get a straight line. And it has a slope. You take any set of events, you take that information and plot it in the logarithmic relationship. If you get a slope, guaranteed. This is a self-organizing set of events, self-organizing criticality operating in a complex open system. The stock market does this perfectly. And it does Fibonacci numbers perfectly. And it's not predictable at all. All right? Fractal geometries. Fractals are the physical record of the behaviors of a self-organizing, open, complex system. All the things you see in nature that are fractal are the record of what happened before. So when you look at brain coral, you look at the shape of the human brain, you look at what makes an olive tree, and you can recognize a tree and a grove of trees and a field of trees and mountain ranges. Everything that occurs in nature is fractal. Absolutely everything. It's fractal. Benoit Mandelbrot figured that out one day looking out the window in his laboratory. It had no basis in anything that had ever happened in mathematics before. He just thunk it up. And we've been doing fractal modeling, fractal predictors, fractal pattern recognizers, fractal information compression engines. We've been doing this stuff now for 20 years. He was dead right. The universe is fractal because the universe is a single system. It is open, it is complex, it is self-organizing, and it works in quantum leaps. 1 over F noise thresholds means that in between events, there's nothing. It's a quantum universe we live in. Standard Model got that right. It's a quantum universe we live in, for sure. So, you take those 4 rules, you add the Fibonacci series of numbers, and you remember that Einstein said something that science utterly rejects now. He said, all of our measurements of magnetism, electromagnetism, gravitational field effects are all effects. The only thing that's real is the magnetic potential. Before he died, Einstein got that. Tesla knew it to his core. There is a magnetic potential that operates from the physical vacuum through every scale of evolution. But the Standard Model denies it. You add what happens when events, when bodies of information intersect, the way in which they intersect and the angle at which they intersect and the properties they exhibit when they intersect are all part of what we call a Y-bias interaction. And all of that's explained in the monograph. The angle is critical. There are optimal and minimal angles of intersection in Y-bias interactions that operate to define what works and doesn't work in self-organizing criticality. That's it. That's what makes the universe work the way it does. Everything in the universe operates according to this set of rules. There's a lot of stuff we don't know about yet, but I'm here to tell you that Tommy Bearden figured out that out of the physical vacuum, you can use this set of rules and you can solve the source charge problem because electrons are the product of scalar interactions at finer scales. There's an engine in the universe that produces them. And the source is the source that Tesla knew was infinite and absolutely accessible in any address. He used it, and it's what drove all of his most amazing science. He tapped this source. This is Einstein's vector magnetic potential. It's called the Bohm-Aharanov experimental protocol. All it says is that it fundamentally disproves a basic tenet of the Standard Model, which says that there's no such thing as a non-local field effect. What this says is that if you take an information set and you shield it in every imaginable way, it will still be affected by non-local field effects whether you shield it or not. This is hard science. It's very sophisticated, really esoteric stuff. And this is the one that tips the apple cart over. What is mass? Let's get down to basics now, because this is where you live. What's mass? In the Standard Model, mass is defined as that property of matter which demonstrates inertia and complies with the laws of thermodynamics. Well, what the hell is it? What is mass? I'm just about to tell you. Any of you seen this picture? It's awesome. This is a very fine picture of the top of a mass coronal ejection event. It's on the internet. It's in the paper. It's got all the links. What they find out about this picture is that these storms that occur on the surface of the sun are far hotter than the interior from which they arise. See, the model's always been the sun's hotter in the middle than it is on the outside, and the reason you see all this stuff bubbling around is because it's bubbling up from the inside trying to get out. It's dead wrong because it's just totally backwards. What we now know is that what you're looking at here are the top of electric tornadoes. Every one of these filaments is an electric tornado that's all electrons and photons, all. It's right down there at the baseline, and this is so hot. At the top, some of these vortexes are 100 million degrees centigrade. That's right off the scale. The Standard Model and astrophysics is just pulling their hair out trying to figure that one out because they don't get it. They don't understand what the basic rule is. Look, guys at Stanford in the mid-90s used laser light in a vacuum to create matter. It's not supposed to happen. The Standard Model says you can't do that. They used light, photons only, in a hard vacuum. Banged monochromatic lasers together and created positron-electron pairs, and they measured their lifespan and their mass. That's what happens on the surface of the sun. It's happening all the time. What Tesla knew that science has forgotten, that the Big Bang Theory denies, and this is the critical element, and we'll move on, is that everything in nature, at every scale, from the most minute to the grandest of all scales, the cosmos itself, is being created and uncreated in every instance, at every address, all the time. We live in a dynamic universe that is never at rest. What Tesla also knew is that while the physical vacuum energetically is always in balance, every event at every address is always out of balance. And it is the fact that this imbalance operates in a scalar way that gave him a way to amplify the imbalance. He knew that, science doesn't. We know it now, and now you know it. Ever seen this picture? It's called a Bose-Einstein Condensate. 2 years ago, some guys managed to drop matter in a hard vacuum down to 1/10 of a degree above absolute zero. And the reason they did that was because they were thinking that all of the matter in the chamber, what little was left, was going to aggregate into a single point. And it did. But it didn't do it the way they thought it would. What it did was it formed a standing wave, a smoke ring. And I want you to see some things when you look at this. You see these spaces? Those spaces are pure Fibonacci relationships. Pure Fibonacci relationships between the spaces. And what's the difference between a standing wave and a tornado? What's the difference? It's the same phenomenon. It's exactly the same when this collapses and this becomes three-dimensional. Because this isn't just sitting there, it's spinning around. When they raised the temperature 1/10 of a degree, this thing became 26 different kinds of matter. It just exploded into the vacuum, liberated all kinds of light. They dropped the temperature, and bingo bobby, it went right back to the same singularity the same way. It defied every calculation they made. And they still can't explain why it did what it did. And it's perfectly clear why it did what it did when you understand these rules. Here's how nature works. The primary scale is the physical vacuum. The physical vacuum is a seething sea of infinite potential. It is self-referential. It operates at the heart of everything. It is the source of everything in the cosmos. We know there's a physical vacuum because we know about the Casimir effect. And if you don't know what that is, you can find out about it in the paper. The interface between the physical vacuum and our physical world is the zero point. That's what the zero point is. It's the place where the potential being driven to combine into something meaningful from the physical vacuum actually begins to form. And the first scale of organization is what Tommy Bearden calls virtual ensembles. It's a wonderful coin of phrase. Virtual ensembles, potentials of information undifferentiated, intersecting with other potentials of undifferentiated information in a way at some kind of an angle in some environment to produce what science says does not exist, a subquark. Subquarks are very cool. When you look at them in the photographs that were taken in the cloud chamber, the path they make is a dash and a space and a dash and a space and a dash and a space and a dash and a space. And the size of the dash and spaces varies specifically with each kind of material they come from. Whoa! What is that? You mean at that fine scale, subquarks already know what they're going to be when they grow up? They do. They absolutely do. It's why the material world works the way it does, looks the way it does. Because these things come together in ways that are specific. Their information ensembles come together in ways that are specific. And they become the materials that are the elements on the periodic chart. And the product of their interactions at one scale or another is time, all the local linear field effects at some point in time, and all the nonlinear, non-local field effects all the time. And they all work together all the time at all scales. So you take subquarks, two subquarks come together, violate the Pauli exclusion principle, they occupy the same space at the same time. I'm not supposed to do that, but they do. And they create 6 different kinds of subquarks, which have a total of 18 different kinds of characteristics. 3 subquarks make up 99.8% of all the matter and energy phenomena in the world. And the other 0.2% is all that exotic stuff. Okay? At the third scale, there's no such thing as gravity. There's no such thing as gravity. And all the rules of magnetism are backwards. Like attracts like. Opposites repel. It's totally backwards. Doesn't work the way the Standard Model says at all. And everything's spinning. And they're liberating photons as they come together and doing all kinds of interesting things. But there's no mass there. There's no mass. You know why we know there's no mass? Because there's no gravitational field effect. That's absolutely categorically true. Standard Model doesn't want to know that. At the 5th scale, quarks come together to create protons and neutrons, to make electrons, and to make all of the fermions, all the exotic stuff. 26 different kinds of stuff. And at the 5th scale, it's the first time gravitational field effects actually operate. It's the very first time. It's the very first time that we see evidence of the strong and weak nuclear forces. It's 3 scales up from where we find electromagnetic forces, because it's electromagnetic forces that are driving this stuff all the time. But they're not the electromagnetic forces you find being taught in IEEE classes. This is quaternions. This is all 3 of the dimensions plus time polarization. Operates right out of the physical vacuum through the 0 point from the baseline. Then you make atoms. I mean, atoms are a 6th scale phenomenon. Nature's well on its way by the time you get to atoms. How tough is it to do anti-gravitational devices if you understand this? How tough is it? I mean, if you know that the combination of hadrons is what creates gravity in the first place, all you have to do is impose some external field effect that unwinds it. Yeah.
Give them the story where it went through the roof.
Well, yeah, okay. Well, I mean, we know this works, okay? And there are anti-gravitational field effects. And if I have time when we're done, I'll tell you about one. We shot one through the roof, okay? Atoms, it was real scary. I mean, when you're standing around and stuff starts turning pink and you start smelling ozone, pull the plug and run like hell, okay? I mean, I don't have cork on the bottom of my shoes like Tesla did. I'm out of here. So at the 7th scale, now, I mean, dude, nature is like pretty well evolved by now. Now, if you understand how this works and you begin to understand why molecular chemistry is nothing at all like what's described in the textbooks. Because there are field effects operating out of this dynamic set of interactions, and they're going on up and down and in and out of the physical vacuum all the time. Have you heard the term quantum frequency? In the context of this model, the quantum frequency is the frequency at which the pieces that make up the virtual ensembles, that make up the subquarks, that make up the quarks, that make up the hadrons, that make up the atoms, are constructing and deconstructing in and out of the physical vacuum. It's a pump. It's a pump. And it's spinning. And that's why when you go out into the world and you see how this stuff works, there's the Bose-Einstein Condensate in all its glory. That is one of the most magnificent things I've ever seen in my life. I never thought I'd live to see it. And I take my hat off to the guys that did it. That baby represents all the Fibonacci numbers, all the optimal Y-bias angles of intersection. It represents all of the information that occurs in the first 5 scales of organization at almost 0. And it's still spinning. It's a fabulous picture. All right, so here we go. High-density charge clusters, electrons forming themselves into smoke rings. Kenny Shoulder's wonderful work, capturing protons, banging it into stuff. Not supposed to happen. Science says it's impossible. Well, he's only got 6 patents, and he's only been doing it for 25 years. Okay? And he's only taken pictures of it with his tunneling electron microscope. Okay? So, what happens when you tear a hadron apart? That's what it looks like. It has a curve. That's called a roton. These are high-density charge clusters and electron accretion disks taken with an electron microscope. Everything in nature operates in terms of vortices, standing waves, harmonics, and resonance. That smoke ring is 600 feet across. See them all the time when volcanoes erupt. And there's absolutely no difference in the dynamics between that and a high-density charge cluster or a Bose-Einstein condensate. It's exactly the same phenomenon. And there's the model of it. It comes right out of our Y-bias calculations. Guys at the University of Indiana put those together for us, and if that's not a torus that looks just like Kenny Shoulder's high-density charge clusters, I never saw one. That's how it comes to be, and we now know how they form. Hurricane Katrina. You recognize that? Does that look like anybody's star nebula?
Yeah.
What's the difference?
None.
There's no difference at all. It's just a matter of scale. The dynamics are exactly the same. Look at that. That's our Y-bias information cranked out as a fractal. The information that produced the vortex now produces this fractal. That's our set of numbers. It's an archetypal shape that occurs everywhere in nature. And there it is in the real world, a waterspout. You can do it in your swimming pool. Take a Frisbee. Don't rattle the water too much. Take your Frisbee, lay it flat, spin it around, pick it up. Stand still. If you're good at it, it takes a little practice. If you're good at it, you'll create a little vortex. And it'll keep spinning and it'll keep spinning, and pretty soon, someplace else on the top of your swimming pool, you'll see another one. And if you drop a drop of black ink in the one you created, it will go under the water and come up in the other one. It will, guaranteed. I've done it myself. How does that happen? It's a phenomenon of self-organizing criticality that operates with non-local field effects that are as coupled as they can possibly be. And it's operating in a 7th scale phenomenon. This happens all over the cosmos at every scale. Everything is connected. Everything. There's a standing wave. The Earth with its moon. What's the difference between that and a soliton? It is a soliton. Well, there's Uranus. There's Saturn. What's the difference between that and the Bose-Einstein condensate? Nothing. See that chart? I don't know if you can see that set of numbers, but what that says is that that number right there says that the distribution of mass in our solar system, from the Sun to the orbits of each of the planets, all the way out to Pluto, which is not a planet officially anymore, and it's actually, Pluto is the variable that makes it not perfect. But the distribution of matter in our solar system is within 0.00043% of a perfect Fibonacci distribution. And it is true everywhere in the cosmos, ladies and gentlemen. Here's what you get to see about this model. If you've never seen Hoag's object before, I introduce you to it now. Hoag's object has a galaxy at the center, and those are not stars going around out there. Those are galaxies. Those are galaxies around galaxies. Hoag's object. The Sombrero Galaxy, we get to see the same thing from the side view. What keeps the universe in balance? These guys right here. That's called a black hole. That's a photograph of a black hole. And it gets better. That's a black hole that's sucking a galaxy into its maw. That's a Hubble telescope image. And there's another one. For real. It's the real deal out there. What are black holes? They're vortexes. What do? While the vortexes are organizing, taking stuff from the physical vacuum up through the stages of evolution and pumping energy out of the physical vacuum to create the universe, the black holes disaggregate it and pour all that energy back into the fountain. The physical vacuum is always in balance electrodynamically. And that's why everywhere else in the universe, at every scale, is energetically out of balance. That's how it works. That's how it works. It's just that simple. And these rules work everywhere. The universe is not a clockwork mechanism. Nature operates according to a set of simple, elegant, universally applicable rules which are consistent at all scales, from the 0 point to the infinite expanses of the cosmos. There was no Big Bang to mark the beginning of the universe. The universe is infinite, boundless, and timeless. If a seemingly universal phenomenon did occur 20 billion years ago, it was almost certainly one of a similar recurring phenomena of its type, which have also occurred over the eons in the past and will eventually happen again in the future. We know the Standard Model is not correct. We know that all of these things operate according to a very simple set of rules. In our model, we talk about consciousness. It's a very interesting subject. We make some stabs at defining what it is, where it comes from, what it does. Our notion of it is that the physical vacuum complies with all the requirements of the ancient Eastern traditions, which they call the One. Maxwell and Whittaker called it the primary field of infinite scalar potential. In Y-bias and angularity theory, we call it the physical vacuum. And my notion about this is that consciousness is just as much a part of the cosmos as anything else we find. And it has its origins in the same place, and it speciates and individuates in the same way as everything else. It is infinite, it is eternal, it is not a product of the interaction of increasing sophistication and complexity in matter. It is not. And we know how consciousness works in many of its aspects, and we know how it couples with physicality, thanks to Vladimir Proponin and many of his colleagues. We know those coupling constants. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's the model. Unfortunately, I guess we've run out of time. What we've tried to do with this model is design engineer the structure of new materials, and we have some that are working. And we've also tried to design engineer some physical devices that make it possible to do what Nikola Tesla did by using harmonics in resonance, by amplifying oscillations and frequencies, by tapping the infinite field of energy in a way that is sustainable and benign. There's no reason for us to be burning fossil fuels, damming rivers, or splitting atoms and creating a bunch of nasty nuclear waste. If you want a copy of the monograph, all you have to do is get a hold of us, as I say, and I've left a copy here with the Tesla people, and they have my permission to give it to you on request at no charge. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me via the Nova Institute website. I'll be happy to correspond with you and share whatever information we have. But we're onto something, and we want you to know about it, and we want you folks to be able to use it in all the magnificent, industrious, imaginative, innovative ways that only you are capable of. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, David Yurth. David, will you be at the social this evening? Will you join us at the social this evening?
You bet.
Okay.